certainly for families, the question of what the future is going to hold and what can be done about the future is a very central, important question. So it's really good to have some sense of how would you tackle a question like that, and how can you break it into its components and do something about it. So I'm going to, in a kind of short sense, try to give some sense of what is possible here. This is a quote, really, that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So looking back at life as you go through it, it makes a lot more sense than when you're walking into it. And the same with the future, that the future has yet to happen, so how could you make sense of it? It's sort of a kind of almost like a conundrum for people. However, the future is not written, and it can be influenced in anybody's life because the future hasn't happened. It can be made to happen in particular ways. Whereas the past, of course, it's all done, it's already happened, whereas the future can still be formed. And many people kind of wait for the future to happen to them. And this can create a sense of helplessness because the future has you hostage because you're sitting waiting for it to happen. And another way to look at the future is rather than to wait for the future, to be proactive in making the future happen. And most of us often will put things off, hoping that somehow things will clarify, but that simply delays the what could be done to influence the future. But what it is that can be done to influence the future won't be obvious to lots of people because it's something that needs to be kind of worked out. It's not, if it was obvious, there wouldn't be a dilemma. But for a lot of people, what to do about the future is uncharted territory. There is no roadmap. It isn't like it jumps out at you and you know exactly what you should be doing. And of course, people that do know exactly what they should be doing frighten me because I'm not sure how they got that way. Because most people I know find creating the future a bit daunting. So in this sense, it's important to remember that if there were clarity, we wouldn't have a problem. But we all have a stake in the future turning out well. So in this sense, considering the future is in your own interest. It's an enlightened sense of self-interest when one thinks about the future. But we can influence the future by what we're doing today. And that's, once you recognize that, then you're positioning yourself to be effective in terms of dealing with the future. What we do today, in fact, creates our future. And what we don't do today creates our future. So not acting can also create a future for us because we simply have not engaged on the issue. But you can shape the future. In many ways, you do it one step at a time, but by seizing control of the process of thinking about the future, you're already going through the kind of starting gate of putting some things in place. And so if that is the case, if people can come to some resolution that they are going to be proactive about the future, then in some ways, the rest of it is just simply the problem solving of trying to figure out what the steps will be. This Confucius said, "Study the past if you would define the future." And I don't really know what he meant, particularly by this, but I think what my take on it was really that it's in the past that we create the conditions for the future. So in this sense, if we understand how we've got to in our current position, then we can kind of figure out what we'll do next. Now, the life and potentials of people can be safeguarded or nurtured. So the decision to help somebody get a good life is in itself a decision to safeguard that life. Because by deciding that you want someone to have a good life, you've already set in motion the kind of thinking and intentions and hopes for the future that are if you like, the gist of what could be down the road, a good life for someone. So we need to see the value of the intentions of people projected into the future as being significant. In this sense, what's your heart's desire for the person for the future is really a very big preparatory step in terms of creating it. And in this sense, many people aren't sure what their intentions are, and so therefore don't have that foundation yet of how to build on those intentions. Look back, if you look at the many family situations, the intentions that they had at an earlier point helped create what came later. So in this sense, the intention is the child of the whatever is created. It's a lovely quote. In the end, it's not going to matter how many breaths you took, but how many moments took your breath away. In this sense, the idea of the future is to, of course, have something to worth kind of living for, the things in life that take your breath away. And if that is part of the intention, then the chances are of a much more enriched existence for people, because that's what people are looking at, not just any life, but a life that could be really kind of breathtaking, if you want to use that term. So the ideals that people have about the future sooner or later get translated into practical projects. But if we've neglected the future, and I would say it's human nature for many people to neglect the future, they kind of hope somehow something will come along that will rescue us and sort it all out for us. But when that doesn't happen, we're left really with no way forward, because the way to get forward with some of these questions is not to wait for them, but to begin to fashion what the future ought to look like. This begins really with the question of what could be for people, and a lot of us may not know when we start out what could be, and many of the speakers over these last 2 days have spoken about the importance of starting to develop a picture in your mind about what could be. Because even if you're not sure if it could be, at least now you have things to consider by way of different possibilities for the future. So safeguarding the future begins with trying to imagine different futures that could be or possibly could be, even if you're unsure really how to progress them. Because when you have no image of the future, it's hard to do something about the future. But when you begin to develop pieces of the future in your mind's eye, then the creating of them eventually becomes a little bit easier. But the idea of safeguarding the future ought not to be about simply keeping people safe. When people think of safeguarding the future, they might just look at the question of keeping someone safe or not harmed or something like that. But a safe life only wouldn't be the same as well-being. You can be quite safe, but not have much of a life. And in fact, you could have an empty life because people have made it too safe. In this sense, safety and security has been allowed to trump other things. So in this sense, these two things aren't opposed to each other, safety, security, absence of harm, but they can complement each other. They needn't be set up as either or. You can have both things. You can have well-safeguarded people, but also lots of well-being for people. Many people are often told, well, you can only have one of those, and I think that's a proposition to reject. You should think, well, we can have both, because people have had both down through the centuries. They've safeguarded themselves, but they've also made a life that's been a good match for them at the same time. But this quote from Chris Maticus, to do that, you have to enter into life, and you could stay out of life in the hope that it would be easier. But as people live their lives, what you find is there's a lot of turbulence in life, and yet there's satisfaction in that turbulence. So if you stay away from life and hide from it and insulate people from it, then they'll never taste that life because they're afraid of the harm that might come. but that might come at the greater harm of having no life. So in this sense, getting your mind around the fact that people can have a life and also be safeguarded is a bit liberating, because it allows both things to happen, some kind of safeguarding of the person, but also some kind of rich life resulting. And families quite naturally want to avoid anything that would produce harm or hurt or suffering for their family member. It couldn't be more natural than to want that. And the best way to do that is really through intentional safeguards that offset whatever hurt or harm that you're worried about. You can, and people have down through the centuries, created all kinds of ways to make sure they don't get hurt, or the people that they know and care about do not get hurt. So it is quite possible to safeguard people if one pays attention to what are the vulnerabilities that may be present, and then have something that you're going to do about it. So that can be done. That part of safeguarding the future in the sense of safeguarding the person simply means attention to whatever safeguards need to be in and around people's lives so that all is well. But all that would do is just prevent harm or hurt. And preventing harm and hurt isn't the same as having a rich life. So the second part of that question of imagining a rich life for the person is really a different kind of question. It's a question of trying to see what would be the ideal life for a particular person. And since it isn't always obvious what an ideal life might be for a particular person, as many of the speakers have said, this has to begin a process of exploring with people what might possibly be and what kind of life would look good. And again, we saw in the previous presentation that some of the individuals had indicated to their parents, well, I'd like to have a life, for instance, like my brothers or other people or whatever. Well, that's the beginning of identifying for that person what is a good life, or at least some initial ideas about a good life. And eventually, as you saw, that good life began to materialize. But it wouldn't have materialized if people hadn't been trying to define what it was in the first place that would fulfill a person or satisfy them or excite them, as the case would be. So the protective or defensive safeguards are very valuable, and they are practical typically. You can do many things to keep yourself and other people safe and not get hurt, but of course it isn't always straightforward. In this sense, some safeguards are better than others, and if you look more deeply into it, sometimes the safeguards get in the way of actually safeguarding. So that's a kind of a paradox, but it's something to kind of think about. But what could fulfill a people or a person's life can also be understood because it arises from who the person is. This is what many people mean by person-centered, that the good life arises from who the person is and what their nature is, and finding the conditions then that allow that particular person to flourish. I remember a man I'd met who had become actually a highly skilled martial arts, I don't know what you call it, practitioner. He was a black belt in Taekwondo, and it had become for him one of his passions in life. And so part of what gave him status, accomplishment, a sense of a good life was his enjoyment of Taekwondo. And he was lucky to have had support to become a very proficient practitioner of it. But for him, that would be the idea of the good life, or at least an element of the good life. But for other people, becoming a kind of Taekwondo practitioner sounds like the worst possible thing that could happen to them. And so for them, that wouldn't be the good life. So in this sense, the good life is finding the things that work for a particular person and then safeguarding the good things, not simply avoiding hurt, but safeguarding those things so that people have the opportunities in life a home of one's own, a job of one's own, relationships and belonging of one's own, accomplishments of one's own. All of these things are worth exploring. So safeguarding the future begins with exploring all those things so that you know what to do in the future about them as they unfold. Vulnerability does not take away your strength. In this sense, vulnerability can be managed. It's not the thing you should concentrate on in terms of safeguarding the future, because even with vulnerabilities, people have all kinds of strengths, and so it's important to develop people's strengths, if you want to put it that way, and to capitalize on the things that they have going for them so that we don't waste people's lives and all of the gifts and strengths and things they have going for them. So in this sense, the safeguarding the future is safeguarding the person, their gifts, the very specialness of who a person is once one has an appreciation for that, then it's much easier to do something that would safeguard those gifts, or almost the promise of that person's life, the things that they could do with their life. And again, we saw the pictures earlier that Errol Cox had shown of people that had no life. You know, the person sitting on the bed in the wards, that is really a wasted life, a life that could have been many things. Today, fortunately, we don't start at that place anymore. We have all kinds of things that people could do in their life, but we still have lots of people for whom they're not doing with their life what they could be doing with their life, and so the future will be a less than existence because there was no sort of way to capitalize on what could be for people. So a person's life is a great gift, and if you start from that premise, then the safeguarding the future is really just doing all the things that help put in place some likelihood that the person's life will be enriched down the road, a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, and of course, ultimately, when I'm no longer here. So from a parent's point of view, safeguarding the future is what you can do now while you're still here, and you and others to kind of create the kind of arrangements that will succeed you potentially. So safeguarding the future involves a fair bit of searching for what those things might be, and over a period of many years, that can mean many different kinds of questions that arise. And this is why you could see in some of the stories that when families tackle that, it's a big job to do it. When anybody tackles it, it's a big job to do it. So what makes it an easier job to do it is don't do it alone. That to draw people into the exercise of safeguarding the future, the reason being is that individual families have enough to do and can't attend to every possible potential. That's why drawing people into the mix brings other views, other people that could be helpful in this aspect or that aspect. Otherwise, families have to have the answer to everything, which is a big ask. But families getting support from other people on this question make it a lot easier to get things done. But one of the things that I think has to be thought about here is when we're safeguarding the future, is it really the person's needs that are going to be paramount, or is the safeguarding really about our needs? Because there's a difference between the family's needs and the person's needs. And you could safeguard the future to satisfy the family's needs and yet not satisfy the person's needs. So sometimes it's important with safeguarding the future to say, what does the parents need or the brother or sister relative to their family member, and what does the family member themselves need? And this raises the question of whether safeguarding the future is done to people or with them. In this sense, if one wants to safeguard the future of a person and not take the person into the process, then the future will be something done to them rather than something done with them. that arises from their contribution to the process. And there is a tendency in all of us to take care of things and in the process decide for others what is best. And yet we still have a choice there that we don't have to decide what's best for people. We can simply decide with people what might be best. So knowing that we have that, then people themselves can be part of a process, whatever the process might be, to the extent that they want to be part of a process. And of course, as we've seen in some of the stories, the people with disabilities have their own ideas about their lives, their dreams, their intentions, and these can be taken into account in safeguarding the future. In this sense, these days we see a lot more people with disabilities being a bit more affirmative of what their view of things are, but we equally can see that in some cases what they think hasn't been integrated into the kind of plan for the future, the possibilities for the future. And there's a saying in the sort of self-advocacy movement of nothing about me without me. It's a pretty good slogan because people do want to be part of the solution. And how many of you think that you really don't, many people really don't want to have the life their parents had? Is that possible? Yeah. Well, in my experience, most of us don't say, oh, I'd really just like to live identically to my parents, you know, or my brother or my sister. But there may be many things about the parents' life that they do like, but there may be things that are distinctive to their own preferences. So in this sense, safeguarding the future means some kind of reconciliation of different visions of what the future could look like. And that's not always easy to work out, but it's good to not set up opposition where there's no need for it. In this sense, to reconcile the family's view of an issue and the person's view of an issue means that we could have a kind of win-win, a kind of peace in the neighborhood kind of solution rather than somebody feeling left out and alienated by decisions that others have made for them. And so what is the most important thing for a person is a pretty good place to start. In this sense, to focus on safeguarding the future isn't really simply about keeping people safe now. It is about the person's personhood, their priorities, their potentials, and to some extent their will and intentions for their own life. And many people with disabilities, like any other group of people, may not know what their own intentions are either. That's why when you ask people, they don't have answers to questions because they've never thought about it or they don't know what they want. So part of the process of safeguarding the future in many instances is giving people time with the future so that they can work out for themselves really what the future might be, not having thought about it. And in this sense, we're not talking about one conversation, we're talking about many conversations, possibly involving all kinds of people other than the parents or the brothers or sisters, because other people give people ideas about the future, role models for the future, and whatnot. So if people are to have a thriving future, what have they seen? What have they experienced? What has given them something to think about that might be a piece of what they eventually will do with their life? What I was talking about yesterday is kind of life tasting. Life tasting is get out there, taste a lot of things, see what really tastes good, what didn't taste good, what seemed like a good idea at the time, and in the process, find your feet in your own life. And so the safeguarding the future could be some exercise in rescuing the person from bad things, but it could also be an exercise in putting in place the very things that make life worth living. In this regard, it's hard to know what all those are because you can discover them at any age. But if you're going to safeguard the future, getting people in touch with themselves, their own potentials, their own dreams, their own hopes, their own capacities is a very powerful safeguard because they are now acquainted with themselves and can give some kind of indication to others as to whether things are suiting them. So, this is a quote from Noam Chomsky, probably one of the most pessimistic writers you could ever find, really, in many ways. And here he is talking about optimism. Optimism is a strategy for making a better future, because unless you believe that the future can be better, you're unlikely to step up and take responsibility for making it so. So he's really addressing the fact that if we can be optimistic about the future, then we can build it. If we're already deeply pessimistic about the future, we'll say, oh, it can't happen, and in this sense, be defeated before you even start, because the proactive approach to the future just would have to be based on the premise we can make it happen. We can make this become what is needed. And that requires a bit of faith in the future, but also faith that where there's a will, there's a way. And again, I've been struck by so many of the presentations, how many people are living the life that people told them they couldn't possibly live, you know? And so all these people that say it can't be done may simply be incorrect, because people with disabilities and their families have demonstrated time and again all kinds of things that others said it couldn't be done. So in this sense, I think there is a deeper question for a lot of people is do they have faith that there could be a future? Because if you have no faith that there could be a future, then anything done to influence the future won't happen. Because you'll think it's a waste of time, or no good will come of it, or something like that. And that, of course, creates a self-defeating kind of psychology. So a good thing to start with is what would keep hope alive and optimism alive, and staying positive so that these good things can be created. Now, families, one of the great admirable qualities of families is that they are there for people. It's in time and again, in my experience, when all hell breaks loose and things go wrong and whatnot, suddenly the only people around are families. Everybody else has kind of left town and isn't there. So the family's sort of the last stop in terms of taking care of things. And to their credit, families are there for the rest of people's life. They're the single most dependable presence in people's life. And that's, I think, just an amazingly admirable thing, because families wouldn't have asked in every instance to be the kind of backstop that holds all things together, but they are there, and they're more reliable than governments, they're more reliable than agencies and systems, and so on. So families really do have a stake in well-being of people and do something about it. So it's a very admirable thing. But it would not be admirable to ask families to do something about the future and then walk away from them and say, go for it. Because that would be extremely unfair to families. Families will do whatever they can, but they cannot be everything to people. And so in this sense, another way to think about this process is to think about what would be helpful to families so that they can play a role in safeguarding the future. And it's different from one family to the other, but certainly one of the things we notice from social science is that people that lack social support find everything harder to do in life. And people that have social support, it just makes everything easier in life. So the solution isn't to burden families with more to do. The solution is to surround families with allies and friends and others so that the challenges are more manageable. And you'll see in many of the stories that the families that had a bit of a network around them, support circles, things of that sort, were able to manage and carry on. Whereas I think for many, if it was just them alone trying to do something, it's quite difficult. Everything is easier when the work is shared. So this raises the question of safeguarding the future by safeguarding the safeguarders. In this sense, if families get support, they can be much more effective and much more creative and so on, but if they're kind of abandoned to the task of the future, then in this sense it's been made harder for families, and often at a stage in their life when they're getting older. And so in this sense, the sooner and younger families are to develop a kind of network of people around them, the more likely they'll be able to create that kind of future, because they're at an age where they have the energy for it, but they also have the support for it. So in this sense, the future begins earlier rather than later. But again, families say, well, how do you create a network around you? And that's a very good question. But as you'll see, more and more, we now have networks, intentional networks that families have created. So without really trying to reduce it to a short answer, the reality is lots of families have figured this out and have some kind of network around them. So that's enough to know at the outset, because of course families can coach you with their own experience. There's trainings you can go to, there's things you can read and whatnot. But just knowing that, you know, you can create intentional support makes the whole idea of some kind of ambitious imagining better for the future and gradually putting it into place much more likely. What has come of all this, safeguarding the future? Well, it's interesting, again, and this is, Errol did it in his presentation, but we now have people with disabilities, and not just in one country, in many countries, where you could say that because of the social movement that we've been in, almost every possible thing that would enrich the life of people with disabilities has been attempted, and people have been successful with it. And it's very important to remember that we can find no other period in history where the barriers that people with disabilities have faced have improved so much over a period of two, now almost 3 generations. And this may not feel like a golden age, but in historical terms, we can find no other period in history where there's been so much progress. And it's important to remember this. This is not a bad time to be alive. Every possible thing that you could want to do, if you had a disability, people have somehow done it. And I'm always interested to know this because people tell me all the time this or that can't be done. And I unfortunately have to alert them to the fact that it has been done for decades somewhere because they just haven't heard about it yet. And so all over the place, people are pioneering new things, including getting homes of their own, lives of their own, jobs of their own, marriages of their own, not to frighten you, all kinds of things. And if you're interested in those things, and people are, then there's a whole set of possibilities to imagine better about that would be very interesting to take on board. Even if you didn't do them all, it's kind of interesting to see that you have so many options in 2015 going forward. For instance, I personally know at least 15 people with disabilities who have climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Now, why in the world they'd want to do that's another question. There may be some good explanation for it, but it doesn't really matter. If that's what they want to do with their life, they think it would be a very cool thing to do it, and then go do it. Isn't that interesting? And how many of you think some families of those 15 would be terrified at the prospect of their family member climbing Mount Kilimanjaro? And all those interesting diseases you can get in Africa, you know, and then the American guys with the rifles trying to kill rare species. What happens if they were in the wrong, savanna, So you could let your mind worry. But the reality is that people with disabilities are having adventures of all kinds in 2015 that were beyond conceivable even a generation back. So the idea that there's nothing to think about, nothing to try on for size is not the case. There's all kinds of lives being lived now that are kind of interesting and whatnot. And we've just seen some of the living arrangements that people with disabilities are in. And there's so many more that we just haven't had time to kind of share. So it's a very good time to support families and the people that know people with disabilities and our friends and so on in some kind of exercise of safeguarding the future, but a future that's richer and even better than the past, a future that could be even now. Just to give you an example, there are jurisdictions in the world now where over 70% of people with disabilities are working at least 10 hours a week in a regular job. That's 7 out of 10 people that have a serious kind of work role. Well, that may be a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, but at 30 years ago, they didn't have those jobs. But over the last 30 years, the employment rate went up. And I use that as an illustration that the future could be even better than anything we could imagine now if we let ourselves imagine now and familiarize ourselves with what's already been achieved. So my fear would be that families are told that and then nobody comes to the party. So I think what would be very helpful for families and for others is to have people who see the value of safeguarding the future, want to help out in some form or fashion, and together try to work their way through the kinds of things that are going forward. In this sense, going back to social support, people with social support will always do better than people that don't have it, because doing things all by yourself is always going to be harder, no matter what. But somehow, when others share the task with you, somehow it gets easier and people get there. And so I have great faith that families will do everything they can do. So I'm more worried about the rest of us, whether we will do what we should be doing to help families with this particular task. In this sense, there's a challenge to create an atmosphere where families feel that the load is lighter and the job is more likely to get done. With that, then people would be encouraged and strengthened and have faith because they feel like I'm not kind of having to figure all this out by myself. So just a couple other points. It's not a single task. The future is created by 1,000 discussions and 1,000 decisions. So it's not like, oh, I did my planning meeting, back in 2015 and got all sorted. You can have planning meetings till the cows come home because there's always something to think about, new decisions to make, and so on. So it's rather important to see the future and safeguarding the future as a process that is ongoing and that always can reinvent itself as need to be. And of course, if you start early, you get into the habit. If you leave it late, it's new to you, and it's a little bit harder. So in this sense, younger families ought to get practice with this because it'll just become a habit going forward. And similarly, those who would support families. So the issue can't be just keeping people safe. Because what that will do is actually make people suffer. Because when you're safe and you have no life, that is inflicting a new suffering on people. It's good to be safe, but it's also good to have something to look forward to, a good life that really suits you. And so the aim of safeguarding the future, even though the word safe is in there, isn't to make people safe. It is to make it possible to live fully as possible while one can, at whatever age you are. So, thank you.